There was a time when life finally felt calm and steady, a point where everything that once felt chaotic had settled into quiet simplicity. Years of struggle, sacrifice, and endless responsibilities had finally led to a place of peace, a small wooden cabin surrounded by nature, built with care and love. Every corner of that cabin carried the touch of dreams that took decades to shape. The walls held the echoes of laughter, of nights spent planning a future that never seemed certain, but was always worth fighting for. It wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of survival. Every plank, every nail, every faded photograph on the shelf was a reminder of the battles that had been fought and won. It stood as a sanctuary, a reward for all those years of putting others first. The cabin was meant to be a safe place, the kind of place where silence feels warm instead of lonely, where mornings begin with sunlight slipping through the trees instead of alarm clocks and deadlines. Then came the familiar knock at the door. The voice on the other side carried memories, promises, and a kind of pain that only family can bring. When she said she needed help, it was impossible to say no. After all, family is supposed to mean everything. The door opened again, and so did the heart that had once been broken and mended too many times before. There was a sense of hope that maybe this time things would be different. The cabin that had once been built for solitude became shared again, filled with conversation, plans, and a feeling of togetherness that had long been missing. It started with small gestures, shared meals, laughter, talks late into the night about life and how fast it changes. It felt good to help, to give again, to feel needed. The silence that once filled the cabin was replaced with the sound of someone moving about, rearranging things, making the place feel alive. It was comforting, even healing, to watch new energy flow through the space that had once only known stillness. But behind every smile was a flicker of something unreadable. Something that didn't quite fit the warmth of those early days. There was a kind of curiosity, almost hunger, in the way she looked at the cabin, not as a home, but as a possession, something valuable that could be used rather than cherished. The heart that had opened out of love didn't notice it at first. Love has a way of blinding the truth, especially when it's tied to hope. Hope that old wounds could heal. Hope that mistakes could be forgiven. Hope that family could feel like family again. But the foundation of that hope was built on trust, and trust can crumble quietly. It all began so innocently, with one person giving everything and another slowly taking more than they ever deserved. The story of generosity that began with love would soon twist into something far darker, something that would test every meaning of sacrifice and every boundary of forgiveness. At first, everything seemed ordinary, just small, harmless changes that were easy to overlook and even easier to excuse. The furniture was moved around a little, the curtains replaced with brighter ones, the walls freshly painted. It felt good to see life in the cabin again, to see it being cared for instead of gathering dust. The thought was that it was just someone trying to make the space their own, to feel comfortable. But slowly those changes started to feel different, not like acts of love, but like steps toward ownership. The laughter that once filled the rooms began to fade, replaced by constant suggestions and decisions that never asked for permission. Every piece of furniture that was replaced felt like a small piece of history being erased. The place no longer looked like a home built with memories. It looked like a project being reshaped for someone else's vision. There were little hints of distance that started to show. Conversations turned shorter, more practical, colder. Gratitude disappeared, replaced by entitlement. So quietly, it was almost unnoticeable at first. The soft tone of kindness was replaced by the sharpness of control. It was no longer about sharing space, but about slowly taking it over. The photos that once hung proudly on the walls started to vanish one by one without a word. When asked about them, the answer was simple, just trying to declutter, but it didn't feel right. It was as if the past was being wiped clean and replaced by something new, something empty. It wasn't long before the changes grew bolder. The old rocking chair that had been in the corner since the beginning disappeared one day, replaced by sleek modern furniture that didn't belong. The decorations, once chosen with love, were boxed up and stored somewhere out of sight. The cabin didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like standing inside a stranger's house. The person who had once said thank you for every little thing now walked through those rooms with authority, giving orders like it all belonged to them. The heart began to feel that uneasy ache that comes when something sacred starts slipping away. It wasn't just about the furniture or the decorations, it was about what those things represented. The cabin had been built from years of hard work, a reflection of everything that had ever mattered. Watching it change into something unrecognizable was like watching memories being stolen one by one. And yet there was still silence because love always tries to believe the best even when the truth is standing right there in plain sight. Then came the moment that made everything clear. Standing there and watching her give directions to workers about renovations without a single word of consultation, it became undeniable. The look in her eyes wasn't love or appreciation, it was ownership. She had taken over the cabin in every sense. What had once been a safe place was no longer a home, but a house slowly being taken apart by the very person it was meant to protect. The truth began to unfold slowly like a shadow creeping at dusk, impossible to ignore once it settled in. One afternoon, there was laughter coming from the cabin, but it wasn't familiar. Strangers were walking around the porch, admiring the view, taking pictures, and talking about how beautiful the place was. At first, there was confusion. Maybe they were lost or had come to the wrong property. But then one of them mentioned a rental for the weekend, and the world seemed to stop right there. The cabin wasn't lost. It had been sold for nights and weekends without permission. The home that had been built with love and patience had turned into a source of income in someone else's hands. When asked about it, the answer was cold and simple. It's just business, nothing personal. There was no guilt in the voice, only irritation at being questioned. Next, the explanation came quickly that the place wasn't being used enough, that it was time to make it useful, that it could bring in some money. The words cut deeper than any argument ever could because they made it clear that love had been replaced by greed. It wasn't about family anymore, it was about profit. The memories, the warmth, the history of that cabin meant nothing compared to what could be earned from it. And then came the final blow, a suggestion that felt more like an order. If the cabin was going to be rented out, guests needed the space to themselves. There was a shed behind the cabin, small, cold, barely used except for tools and old storage boxes. The suggestion was to move in there temporarily, just until things settled, just until a little extra money came in. It was said so casually, so naturally, as if it were a reasonable thing to ask. The shock was immediate, but the words didn't even have the strength to come out in protest. The move happened quietly. There was no argument, no shouting, just a silent acceptance born out of exhaustion. The shed smelled of wood and dust, with no comfort, no light, and barely enough room to stretch. The sound of laughter from the cabin echoed at night, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Guests came and went, smiling, happy, unaware that the real owner of the home they were renting was sleeping a few yards away in a shed. So every night inside that dark space, the same thought kept coming back. How could love turn into this? How could family mean so little when money became more important than blood? It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of heart. The cabin that once held warmth and safety now stood as a symbol of greed and cruelty. And the person left outside wasn't just displaced, they were erased. What had once been a sanctuary was now a business, and what had once been love was now just a transaction. The first night in that shed was colder than expected, not just from the air, but from the emptiness that settled in. It was a space meant for tools, not for a person to live in, yet there was no argument, no fight left to give. The body shivered under a thin blanket, while memories of warmth filled the silence. Every sound from the cabin carried through the night, the creak of the floorboards, the laughter of strangers, the muffled hum of music. It was surreal listening to others enjoy what once felt sacred while lying in a space too small to even stretch fully. The walls of the shed were thin, the floor hard and uneven. The only light came through a crack in the door, where the glow from the cabin flickered faintly, as if taunting the darkness inside. Sleep didn't come easily. Thoughts twisted and turned the way they always do when pain becomes too heavy to hold. The heart searched for reasons. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe love would find its way back. But with every passing hour, the truth became harder to deny. Love wasn't part of the equation anymore. It had been replaced by calculation and control. The realization hurt more than the cold air biting through the night. The tears that came weren't loud, they were quiet, steady, and raw. It wasn't just about losing a home, it was about losing a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. Days turned into weeks, and that shed became a cruel routine. Waking up to the sound of guests leaving for the day, watching them wave cheerfully unaware of the truth, was like living in a story no one would believe. Meals were eaten in silence, often out of sight, as if existence itself had become an inconvenience. The person who once promised love and care barely made eye contact anymore except to discuss money or bookings. The voice that once called with affection now sounded sharp, impatient, full of irritation at the smallest request. The heart grew quieter too. The will to argue faded, replaced by numb acceptance. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from breaking, and that silence filled every corner of that shed. Each night the question returned, how much is love really worth when it can be traded for a few dollars? The bitterness wasn't born out of anger, but out of grief for what used to be and for what could never return. And yet, beneath all that pain, a flicker of awareness began to form. It wasn't just about being betrayed, it was about seeing someone's true face for the first time. The person inside that cabin was no longer the same one who once needed help. Money had become the center of her world and nothing else mattered. The shed became the evidence of that truth, a symbol of how deeply love can be twisted when greed takes over completely. It was an ordinary afternoon when a car pulled up to the cabin, another group of guests, ready to spend their weekend in the place that once held so many memories. The shed door creaked open just enough to see who had arrived, and at first there was no reason to pay much attention. Strangers came and went all the time, now each one bringing their laughter and noise before disappearing back to their lives. But this time something felt different. The sound of that voice, the way they looked around with familiarity, it stirred something old, a memory that had been buried beneath all the hurt. When they turned and their eyes met, recognition flashed across their face. There was a moment of shock followed by concern, the kind that comes when someone sees something that doesn't make sense. They knew this wasn't right. At first, there was hesitation, a quiet attempt to pretend that everything was fine, but truth doesn't stay hidden when seen up close. Questions started to surface, gentle at first, then sharper, more direct. Why are you out here? Where are you staying? What's going on with the cabin? The answers stumbled out, half-truths at best. The guest didn't accept them, not because they were cruel, but because they cared enough to see what others had chosen to ignore. They watched the way eyes dropped to the ground, the way silence filled the space where words should have been. Then they went inside and saw how the cabin had been turned into something unrecognizable. Photos gone, furniture replaced, personal belongings stored away as if they never existed. It didn't take long for understanding to settle in. The truth came out like a wave too strong to hold back. The story of how everything had changed, of how the shed had become home, while strangers paid to stay in what used to be a safe haven. The guests listened quietly, their face shifting between disbelief and sorrow. They couldn't imagine how someone could do that to their own blood. But instead of just offering sympathy, they decided to act. The next morning, conversations were held, phone calls made, questions asked to people who had no idea the real story behind their pleasant weekend stays. It didn't take much for the truth to spread. When the one responsible realized what was happening, the calm confidence that had ruled for weeks began to crack. Anger replaced control, defensiveness replaced charm. The careful image of running a successful rental business began to crumble under the weight of exposure. The guest had done what no one else had the courage to do. They saw the truth and refused to stay silent. That day, something shifted. For the first time, the lies were visible to everyone. The person who had been hidden away in the shed finally had someone stand beside them. What had started as betrayal was now becoming justice. The truth, once buried beneath greed, was finally being seen for what it was, and the balance that had been lost was beginning to return piece by piece. Everything began to unravel faster than expected. The plan that once seemed flawless started showing cracks that couldn't be hidden. The messages from guests who had booked the cabin, from praise to complaints, as the truth started to leak through small conversations and whispers. People wanted to know whose cabin it really was and why the supposed owner avoided answering certain questions. The once confident voice that commanded every decision started trembling under the weight of guilt and fear. The smile that used to carry pride began to fade when faced with the reality that the lies were no longer safe. What was built on deception always collapses eventually, and this was no exception. The person who once stood so tall now found themselves surrounded by problems from every direction. Friends stopped calling, business slowed, and the eyes of judgment followed everywhere. Those who once believed in the story now turned away as the truth became impossible to deny. There was anger, frustration, and desperation all at once, but the damage was done. The world she had built on greed was falling apart piece by piece, and there was nothing left to hold on to. All that was left was the silence of consequence, a silence louder than any argument. While everything she built was falling apart, something unexpected happened in the quiet that followed. The one who had been cast aside didn't feel hatred anymore, just an overwhelming sense of release. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was peace, the kind that comes from no longer being under someone else's control. The shed that once felt like a prison suddenly seemed smaller than the strength that had grown within those walls. There was no need for shouting, no need for payback. The truth had already done what needed to be done. The surprise came when she returned to the cabin after everything collapsed, expecting pity or forgiveness, but instead found something else: calmness. The same calmness she had once taken for weakness now stood firm and unshakable. The home she had tried to claim for profit no longer felt like hers. The air carried a kind of justice, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and final. There were no threats, no harsh words, only the stillness that comes when truth settles where lies once lived. The guests never returned, the business ended quietly, and the cabin went back to what it was always meant to be: a place of peace. The one who had lost everything didn't just regain a home, but a sense of worth that no amount of betrayal could destroy. The pain that once filled every corner began to fade, replaced by the soft kind of strength that only comes after surviving heartbreak. The little surprise that life had prepared wasn't revenge or regret, but restoration. The cabin stood once more as a symbol not of loss but of endurance, and the reminder that even after being pushed aside, light always finds its way back home. In the end, this story isn't just about betrayal or greed, it's about how love can be tested and how strength can rise quietly from the deepest kind of hurt. Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who teach us the hardest lessons. Losing everything didn't break the spirit, it revealed what truly mattered. The cabin was never just wood and walls, it was a reflection of endurance, of faith, and of the power to rebuild even after being torn down. Spain may have started the story, but peace finished it. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but it came naturally once the weight of anger was finally gone. Every scar left behind became a reminder of survival, not defeat. The person who once stood in the cold shed with nothing but tears ended up standing in the same place, surrounded by quiet strength. The betrayal that could have destroyed everything instead became the reason to begin again. It's proof that no matter how dark love turns, when greed takes over, the truth always finds its way through. The heart heals even when it doesn't think it can, and the soul remembers how to stand tall even when it's been brought to its knees. This wasn't a story of revenge, it was a story of awakening. The cabin now stands in peace, its walls carrying a new kind of silence, not the silence of pain, but of freedom. The lesson is simple: love deeply, but never lose yourself in it. Trust, but stay aware, give, but know your worth. Because even when others take everything from you, they can't take the part of you that learns to rise again. And that is what makes survival beautiful.